Any questions on the male before I move on? Any questions from the recording or from those practice questions, or just in general from the male system? And I was about to make this disclaimer last class, but the same disclaimer that I typically make in lab. This is the reproductive system. We're going to be speaking about terminology that pertains to fertilization, to sex, to the genitalia, and so on. So if any of that makes you uncomfortable, please feel free to let me know. If you need to click off this video at any point, that is totally okay. You can send me an email and we can have a conversation about the topic, okay? So we're starting with our first objective here. This is to explain the cyclic variations in plasma hormone levels that occur during the menstrual cycle. We're also going to describe how these hormones regulate the ovarian and uterine changes that occur during this cycle. So the menstrual cycle is really broken down into two different cycles. There's the ovarian cycle, which are the events of the ovaries itself, the ovum as it matures. And then there's the uterine cycle, which really look at the changes that happen within the uterine lining that prepares for fertilization and results in menstruation. So we'll talk about these two cycles and then ways or time periods rather in which they coincide. So we'll look at the ova and its development. The ova is going to be the mature end product. We go from a primordial follicle, and then that mature structure is going to be an ova. We then will talk about the menstrual cycle, and then we'll talk about the long-term hormonal regulation of female reproduction, so menopause and so on. So the female reproductive system has cyclical changes that are associated with it, the menstrual cycle. This is where there are changes that happen throughout the month, usually a 28 to 31 day cycle. And this is corresponding changes happening in the level of the ovaries and the maturation of that oocyte, all the way to the uterine changes that are preparing for fertilization. With females, unlike what we saw with males, there is a restricted period of fertility. This is called ovulation. So there's a very short window, usually 1 to 3 days, within which a female can fertilize an ovum with a mature sperm, and then we can have implantation and the development of an embryo. So a very short window. For males, this is just an open window, right? The spermatocytes are always being matured, and there's no limited or fixed period with which fertilization can take place. Another important difference with the female reproductive system is that there is an established gamete pool at birth. So females, and this is an existing school of thought, but there is emerging science, there's emerging literature and studies that may be disproving this. So maybe by the time you guys are well into your careers, if it's in healthcare, you'll be studying a different school of thought here. But the established idea is that women are born with a set number of gametes. So we're born with a set number of eggs that will eventually mature each month to be ovulated, and that doesn't change. Whereas males continually reproduce, they undergo new development of spermatocytes, and that happens throughout the entirety of their life, okay? But again, stay tuned for some emerging literature that may say otherwise, that may say that women have primordial follicles that can be recalled into arrested, or recalled from arrested development, rather. So the follicles contain one ovum. So that's a single structure, a single egg, if you will. It is developing within the ovary, and it starts off as a primordial follicle in its earliest stage of development. And then it goes all the way to an oocyte being a mature ovum where it is ready to be fertilized and to be implanted. There's also the granulosa cells. So a part of the follicle is going to be the granulosa cells. And the granulosa cells are very similar in their function and location to the Sertoli cells in males. They're also going to be secreting inhibin, just like Sertoli cells do, and they're playing a supportive role. So they're supporting the development of the oocyte just the way that we saw the Sertoli cells play a supportive role for the spermatocyte. Okay. Looking further here at the granulosa cells, these are the target cells for estrogen and FSH. So FSH coming from the anterior pituitary, estrogen coming from the ovum itself, but also from the ovary. And it's also going to secrete inhibin. So inhibin is what's giving us that negative feedback back onto the anterior pituitary to shut off FSH release, similar function to what we saw in males as well. And then it's going to receive the nutrients, the oocyte that is, will receive the nutrients from the granulosa cells through gap junctions. So this is how the granulosa cell can support the developing oocyte. It's going to be sending nutrients, it's going to be giving it the hormones that it needs, and that is what will help it develop into a mature Graafian follicle. Okay, here is actually an interesting table which compares the functions of our Sertoli cells on the left to the granulosa cells on the right. And they're very synonymous, as we've said. So they're going to be secreting inhibin, which is responsible for the negative feedback aspect. They're going to be secreting, in the case of Sertoli cells, it's the luminal fluid that supports the sperm in their development. In the case of females, it's going to be the antral fluid that's going to help support the developing ovum or oocyte as it is growing into a mature Graafian follicle. Okay, so just an overall function of secreting hormones, secreting inhibin, as well as secreting the fluid that supports the developing gamete. Looking at how ova develop here. So we're starting with an oogonia, which is similar to a spermatogonia or a spermatogonium in males. This is going to be the process of oogenesis, where we go to a mature ova. So females, their number of oogonia is fixed prior to birth. So typically during their fetal development, they have an established number or an established pool of oogonia, and every month one is going to mature and ovulate, and then when that pool is exhausted, that is all of their gametes that can be matured. Now, again, that is the school of thought that's established now, but there may be emerging literature that says otherwise. Meiosis in females begins in fetal life. So when an infant, a female, is inside the uterus, inside her mother, she establishes that set number of oogonia, and this is where that oogonia, those oogonia rather, so that's a plural, they start meiosis. So they start the primary stages in meiosis, and they basically have meiosis arrested until before ovulation. So when that infant is born with her set number of primary oocytes, they are in an arrested state of development. They will not complete meiosis 1 until she becomes of puberty age and she ovulates each month. So then at that point, the meiosis 1 will continue, and then only if that ovum is fertilized will meiosis 2 come to fruition or be completed. So meiosis 2 is only complete after fertilization. So that is if a sperm is introduced and fertilization takes place and we have an embryo development. Otherwise, the meiosis, the secondary oocyte rather, just is shed off or sloughed off with the menstrual lining, with the uterine lining. Okay, so essentially we have an arrested meiosis 1 from the prenatal period in utero all the way up until puberty, where ovulation begins. And then we have meiosis 1 arrested again. And then only if there's fertilization taking place do we have meiosis 2 complete. Let's talk about some of the changes that we see here. So this is what the menstrual cycle is. It's the various changes that are repeated every single month within the ovary and the uterus itself. It contains 2 subcycles. So there's the ovarian cycle, which further has 2 smaller cycles or phases, the follicular phase and the luteal phase. And that is corresponding to the 3 subphases or the 3 subclasses of the uterine cycle as well. Now, these changes are regulated hormonally. So depending on the levels of estrogen and progesterone in females, this is what is going to dictate the changes that we see in these different regions, right? If we have hormonal imbalances, that is what usually results in menstrual cycle imbalances, where we have really long cycles or really short cycles, or inappropriate cycles in terms of skipping certain parts, certain phases. Okay, so we're starting out here with the ovarian cycle, and we're looking at the two sub-phases of the ovarian cycle. There's the follicular phase and the luteal phase. So the follicular phase starts at menstruation. So it starts from the very first day of menstruation and goes all the way up to the 14-day mark, which is usually where we see ovulation. So roughly about 14 days or so. The luteal phase is where we have ovulation all the way up until the day before, the period just before menstruation. This is also a 14-day period. So the entire menstrual cycle is usually anywhere from 28 to 31 days. Okay. Generally speaking, during the follicular phase, we have the development of the ovum within the follicle here. And then generally during the luteal phase, we have the what should be fertilization, implantation, and the beginning phase of pregnancy. If that doesn't occur, we then see regression of the structures here, and then we see the preparation for a new menstrual cycle. All right, so looking a bit further here at what's happening in the follicular phase, so day 1 to day 14. This is starting off with menstruation, but as far as what's happening in the ovary, so because this is the ovarian cycle, we're not really looking at what's happening in the uterus just yet. That's an entirely different cycle. We're really more looking at what's happening in the ovary and the events that are leading up to ovulation of that ovum from the ovary. So we've got FSH coming from the anterior pituitary. That along with estrogen is stimulating the follicular growth. So the follicle to grow and develop. And that starts off as a primordial follicle. So that's going to be what's shown here in 1, or day 1, if you will. And that goes all the way up to a mature Graafian follicle through that first 1 to 14 days. It's going to change a lot in terms of the structure. It's going to eventually develop the zona pellucida, which is protecting the oocyte within the central part of the follicle, as well as the antrum. And the antrum is this small bit of fluid. And the purpose of this fluid is really to help pinch off. It's really beginning to pinch off or kind of evacuate the oocyte itself and really prepare for it to be ovulated or evacuated from the rest of this follicle. Okay, so the development of the zona pellucida, the development of the antrum, these are the features that start to emerge that differentiate a primordial follicle that begins here from a mature Graafian follicle where it's ready for ovulation. We also see the corona radiata. The corona radiata is really this part. It's this crown-like projection of the oocyte itself, hence the term corona. Corona means crown. And it's this part that really just helps evacuate or kind of create this vacuole around the oocyte that prepares it for being pinched off and for evacuated. When we get that mature Graafian follicle, which is at the very end here, that is where we're able to have that ovulation. So this is the mature follicle versus a primordial follicle. And once we get to this end stage, we're ready for ovulation. So what is causing ovulation? What is going to be the stimulus for ovulation? So essentially, these are going to be hormones coming from the pituitary and hypothalamus. So GnRH from the hypothalamus is going to signal LH from the anterior pituitary, and that's going to have a surge. It's going to be a surge in GnRH, likewise a surge in LH. And that surge is what triggers ovulation. So that's going to trigger the rest of the follicle to kind of evacuate or spit out that oocyte that it's been pinching off. So as we can see here, by the development of the antrum, we've been pinching this oocyte off. And then when the surge of these hormones come down to the follicle, that is what's going to trigger the full evacuation and the rupture of the follicle and the spitting out of that oocyte to be fertilized. Okay, that's what the process of ovulation. At this point, we have the end of the follicular phase. So the follicle is at its most mature state. It has evacuated that oocyte, and this is where the follicular phase ends. Now we'll get into the luteal phase. And luteal here meaning that it's going to be that supportive phase that is really preparing the body for fertilization and implantation if there is a sperm available to do so. So we now have a ruptured follicle. What's left behind of the rest of the follicles, so all of this bit that's left behind, that was sort of pinched off, so the rest of that Graafian follicle becomes the corpus luteum. We can see it kind of transition into this yellow structure here. And corpus luteum translates to yellow body, hence the term that's given to this structure that's left behind. The corpus luteum is what will maintain the hormonal secretion. It's going to start secreting estrogen along with progesterone, and it's going to stick around for about 10 days. This is what would otherwise sustain the earlier parts of that pregnancy and start secreting the hormones that are necessary to sustain that pregnancy until that fertilization can be complete, implantation can be complete, and the embryo itself can continue secreting the hormones that are needed to maintain pregnancy. Okay. If after 10 days the fertilization does not take place, we then see a process called luteolysis. This is where that corpus luteum essentially regresses or degenerates, and then the body prepares for menstruation. This is going to be the end of the luteal phase. So if the oocyte that was ovulated here does not become fertilized, then the corpus luteum just regresses. There are signals that are being sent by the fertilized ovum or fertilized oocyte, and those signals would otherwise keep the corpus luteum around. The corpus luteum actually becomes the placenta. And so if that doesn't happen, if that is not fertilized, so those signals are not sent, then after 10 days, we see the regression of the corpus luteum to become the corpus albicans, and that means white body. And that is where it completely regresses, it stops secreting hormones, and that is the trigger for menstruation. All right. So just to kind of walk through those steps of the follicular and luteal phases here again. So we start off the follicular phase, day 1, first day of the menstrual cycle. We start developing a new follicle. So we go from this primordial follicle, it starts changing and developing under the influence of hormones. So estrogen, that's the main hormone that helps the development here. And so we've got the zona pellucida being formed. This is really preparing that oocyte to be pinched off. We've got the granulosa cells that are supporting that development. They're secreting some of the hormones that are necessary. They're also just allowing for the diffusion of nutrients through those gap junctions, so kind of feeding and supporting that oocyte to grow. We then see the development of the antrum, so this bit of fluid here that is really helping to create a vacuole around the oocyte. And then we get all the way to a mature Graafian follicle where we have the full antrum really pinching off the oocyte. We've got the corona radiata, which is that space around the oocyte itself. We've got the cumulus oophorus, and the cumulus oophorus is just this last strip of connection of granulosa cells that are being pinched off from the Graafian follicle. And at this stage, this is the end of the follicular phase. So we're in a mature Graafian follicle stage, and we're ready for ovulation. And when we have that surge of GnRH from the hypothalamus, luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary, we're then going to see the evacuation of the oocyte and ovulation take place. So that'll be about day 14 here. And then we begin the luteal phase. So the other half of the cycle going this direction is going to be the luteal phase. We ovulate, so we evacuate that oocyte. We also have the corpus luteum. So the rest of the follicle becomes the corpus luteum. It starts secreting estrogen and progesterone, which are really important for the development of the uterine lining. So I'll talk about that when we look at the uterine cycle. But those hormones are what are going to prepare the uterus for the fertilized oocyte if there are sperm around to undergo fertilization. In about 10 days or so, if that doesn't happen, the corpus luteum is going to regress or degenerate to become the corpus albicans. So it kind of completely shrivels up, it disappears. And because this is no longer around, because this disappears after 10 days, then we drop the hormone levels. So estrogen levels drop, progesterone levels drop, and that is what really triggers the menstruation. That triggers the sloughing off of the uterine lining, because it is a signal that is being sent that there's no fertilization that took place, so the corpus luteum can disappear, the hormone levels drop, and then menstruation can occur.